Hi and welcome. I am very pleased today to be joined by Michael von der Schulenburg, who is a German member of the EU Parliament, originally escaping from Eastern Germany and has worked since for decades for the United Nations, one of the roles being Assistant Secretary General of the UN Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs. And yes, if I'm not mistaken, you've been positioned in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, Iran, Syria, Haiti, Sierra Leone, Somalia. I'm sure I'm forgetting some of them, but if there was a
So do
war
I
in,
sometimes. There's so many.
yeah,
But
well,
I
if there was a
lived
war
in,
the last 30 years, you were
but
probably
important is that
there.
I always lived in these countries. I didn't only go on missions. I
Yeah.
actually took residence, and since '92, I was always leading UN missions, and they were different. I mean, they had also development aspects. Peace building is, of course, very much development. And then, of course, negotiations and things like this one.
But yeah, now you're in Brussels as a member of the EU Parliament, and I guess in at least over the past 20 or 30 years, security for the Europeans mostly meant we look out in the world and see problems in other places. But of course, now we have a big war on our continent, and some of the rational approach, I guess, to conflict and settlement no longer applies as we send weapons and don't really believe that much in diplomacy anymore. But I really wanted to ask about how you're interpreting the changes in Europe because at this critical time, I see, yeah, the Europeans and Americans are negotiating. They both seem somewhat optimistic. Yet in Europe, no one's really talking about peace anymore. It's just war, and I'm not seeing any alternatives because I don't think necessarily this peace deal is going to be great for either Europe or Ukraine. But this is the only. I don't see any better alternatives being suggested by the Europeans. So how are you? Again, you're there in the EU Parliament. How are you seeing the situation?
First of all, I've been to many war countries, but I tell you, to be in the European Parliament, I find it most difficult, more difficult than some war countries because of the language that's used there, the hatred, the resolutions we get all the time. There are people who are very well paid indeed, and um, and they vote for resolutions to continue a war. Although they don't have a son in the war, they don't have a daughter who is violated, they don't lose their houses, they don't have to become refugees, they get their income every time, and we got even an increase not to feel the inflation that is caused by the war. So I find it a very, very difficult hard because I'm probably the only one in the whole parliament who has actually seen wars and that wars are bad. There's nothing heroic about wars of neither side. People behave awful in wars to each other. There's no one good and no one bad. And here we argue that the war should continue, even when we see the prices paid by other people, mostly by the Ukrainians, and especially now as the war is almost finished. Towards the last months, we always say in the UN that half of all the soldiers of a losing country are lost in the last 4, 5 months of a war because of disintegration, because they have to go out of defense positions and things like this. There are many reasons for it, but the real killings of soldiers is in the end. And that is for a war Ukraine cannot win anymore. So we still send weapons there and say you can win it. It's really awful. So I think we do something extremely immoral in supporting what we call supporting Ukraine.
Because it does feel, as you said, that we're entering the final stages before a complete collapse. You saw this in Kursk as well, and I think this was also experienced in World War II on the German side. At the final stages of the war, this is when when the front line can't be held anymore. You have huge amounts of troops surrounded who are either annihilated or taken prisoners or just withdraw.
Who runs
Yeah.
backward is in the worst position, and it's the one who's losing. It is always like this one. So I don't know the specifics in Ukraine because I'm not there, but I think the logic we have for other wars will apply there just as well.
Yes.
Sadly. I mean, these are young people who probably don't even want to have the war.
But this is why I also want to ask how can you make sense of the rhetoric because there's a certain amount of moral posturing behind the whole thing. I mean, because I've been a bit dismayed, to be honest, because over the past 3 years, I haven't seen much diplomacy at all from the EU. And indeed, this idea that we don't talk to the Russians, we don't even sit down with them, when hundreds of thousands of young men are being slaughtered on the battlefield, that this is somehow, it proves that we are virtuous. So how like you.
I can't, Glenn, I can't explain it. I think it's completely irrational. It's first of all irrational, even if you would argue you have to send weapons for Ukraine to defend itself. You are obliged by the UN Charter at the same time to negotiate. That's what we all agreed on in the UN Charter. 193 countries agreed to this one. But the European thing, that doesn't apply to them. So there is no negotiations. I've now seen, I don't know, something like 10 resolutions about Ukraine, about rearming and all the rest of it. The word diplomacy is not in a single one. And some of the resolutions are 18 pages long. They're all full of hatred. Negotiations, discussing. No, even the last summit, what they decided there, they call it an Erklärung, a statement. They make a lot of demands, but they don't say even to whom they address them to. I mean, to whom? To the Americans? To the Russians? To the Ukrainians? To whom? They just make these demands, and there's not a word about any peace plan, any negotiations, any trying to open up, nothing at all. And at the same time, we are the losers. There is also something else which strikes me. Wars are immoral, but they are not about moral. They're always about interests. And I ask them here always, what is our interest in this war? Why are you fighting this war? I mean, do we have an interest in the sanctions? Do we have an interest to have a war with Russia? Do we have an interest to cut our lines to Asia, the landlines? It's not in our interest. Our economy will collapse over this one. And it does already collapse. It's not in our interest. So why don't we try to find a solution? And this is particularly important for the Ukraine war, but because the European Union never played a role in the Ukraine war. In the whole run-up to the war, not to negotiate with Russia over their security concerns which led them to the war, the EU had no word to say. When UK and United States decided not to pursue the peace deal the Russians and the Ukrainians negotiated in Istanbul, the EU was never asked. All we do is to pay the bill. And so I don't understand I don't understand why we behave like this one. It's completely irrational, completely irrational. And, in wars, we always say the one who refuses reality will be caught up by reality. And that's what happens to us. It will happen to us. We are, after, of course, Ukraine, Europe is going to be the big loser, also internationally. If you look at the last three resolutions, now we have enemy number one is Russia, enemy number two is China, enemy number three is now the United States. And then the other enemy are the BRICS countries. I mean, we are completely out of our mind. We are enemies to the whole world. And we think we are morally on top of the whole thing. Yeah, I think it's European suicide. We're committing slow suicide.
Yeah, it does feel like we're living in a bubble because when I hear different European leaders speak, it's as if the rest of the world betrayed the Ukrainians, but at least we're going to stand. But again, it's not just the Russians, Americans, but I said the Chinese, it's the entire world. Even the majority of Ukrainians want negotiations. So the former advisor of Zelensky,
Trump is quite
Arestowicz, he made
popular
this
in
point.
Ukraine.
Sorry?
Look, think about a family there. Usually they have one child, no, because they have very low birth rates. One child. It is in a war, comes not back, or comes without legs, or is blind, or is so traumatized that he can't have a normal life anymore. Of people who don't get their salary every month. I mean, they don't have electricity. They don't have any heating. Their normal life is completely shuttered. I mean, these people want peace, and we have a Zelensky who's probably never in Kiev. He always is somewhere in Europe, who felt he could continue the war. And I think Trump was absolutely right. Now, you can imagine that I'm not a Trump supporter, but on this one, he's absolutely right. It's what Zelensky wanted. is the Third World War, because he wanted NATO soldiers now to help them to win the war. We call them peacekeepers or whatever, but this were de facto NATO soldiers on Ukrainian territory. It will never happen.
I just read the white paper on the future of European defense. It was adopted on 12th of March 2025, so only a few days ago.
Yeah.
And sorry, 2 days ago. And the text is quite, I mean, this for the EU, as a, I was studying the EU. For people who studied the EU in the 90s and 2000, again, it was normative power, civilian power, a different kind of power. And this is the white paper in which it reads not just Ukraine, but the EU is under attack. And Putin's war of aggression against Ukraine is an attack on the European peace order established after World War II, defending Ukraine against an existential threat to Europe. We have to lift all restrictions on the use of Western weapons delivered to strike targets in Russian territory.
Including Moscow, no? Don't forget.
Yeah.
This is what basic says.
And this is Russia, but also China, driven by the ambition to become a global superpower, is ending the rules-based international order. And then, of course, Belarus, North Korea, Iran, and the US, of course. This is the one sentence that stood out. So the US is seeking to end the war and normalize relations with Russia. This was seen as a huge threat. So now the EU needs to arm Ukraine and prepare for war. Why wouldn't this be a good thing to end the war and normalize relations with Russia? Why is I mean I watched Kaya Kallas say that a defeat of Russia would be good because if it can be broken into smaller states, it would be easier. But what is do anyone define what this actually means? What does it mean to defeat the world's largest nuclear power? How is it going to be done? And what is
But Glenn,
yeah,
we couldn't win this war with massive support from the United States. And now we stand here and with this declaration, and there are others which are even worse, saying that we can still win the war without the United States. I mean, how? Well, how? It is just so unrealistic, the whole thing, that I don't know whether one has to laugh or cry. It's very, very sad. And in addition, Ukraine is basically at the end of the stick. I mean, their army is close to collapse. How do you want to turn this around? Germany wants now to send $3 billion for new weapons into the Ukraine and so on. So we really also try to defy the United States now with their peace proposal. We try to undermine it. We changed a little bit the language by saying, oh, we would also welcome a ceasefire. But a ceasefire on which Russia has to withdraw from the entire territory and take over, it has to be taken to trial, has to pay for all the things. These 10 points from Zelensky that not even Zelensky repeats anymore. But we repeat it in things. At the same time, we don't want to negotiate. And we are in no position without negotiation to change anything or to have any influence of what happens there. Glenn, when Trump will give Putin most what he wants, he ends the war, there is no such thing as a just peace. It just doesn't exist, no? It's always unjust. And if you go to war, the war will decide. That's why you go to war, because you couldn't decide it politically. So the war will decide some of it, and it has decided in this case differently than we assumed. The Americans are clever enough to understand that they have lost the war and they withdraw from it. But we haven't, and I don't know why. What is our interest in continuing this war? If we have a peace deal, or it's probably more a ceasefire deal with plus, Russia is going to control the entire border from the Barents Sea to the Black Sea. That means Europe will be cut off from Asia unless we get along with Russia. We have to understand this. And this is the result of it. Why didn't we agree to a peace deal before? Why didn't we develop a peace deal? I mean, it's a war on European soil. Why we never, not a single time had a peace proposal. Not a single time, except this one telephone call by Scholz, we spoke to the Russians. I remember even in the Iran-Iraq war, because, I went to many wars, even this was a very bitter war with 1 million people dead. Nobody knows exactly the numbers. At all times, there was a link between Baghdad and Tehran. And because they felt they could not speak directly to them, they had asked the UN to do this link. And, I happened to be on one side of the link. So there was all the time communication taking place, which was transmitted by the things. That means in Iraq and Iran behaved more civilized than the Europeans. More civilized. I can't remember in all the talks I had with the Iranians, I was there almost for 9 years, that they would talk to me like I'm being talked to here in the UN Parliament. Of course they would not agree to everything we had to say, but at least they talked calmly with us. And here, I'm treated like a traitor. And all I do is what I do in all the countries where I was at war. Try to have a ceasefire and start negotiating. It's not worth killing all these people. And yeah, it's very strange. It's the strangest thing have had in 35 years of being in wars around the world.
But what
And
is
it hurts me because it's Europe. It's my home. It hurts me. I'm not anti-European at all. And it hurts me that an institution which I felt was meant for peace in Europe has turned into a warmonger. It hurts me, and because I am for the European Union, and I can't hear speeches like von der Leyen who says that we have to prepare for war. I mean, what a language! We have to prepare for war. To say such a thing as a leader of the European Union, it's unbelievable. What for? What war? Do they really believe that Russia is going to attack us? I mean,
But in terms of feasibility, can any of these goals be achieved? If you look at the economics of it, because things are not that well on the economic front either, and now with this plan to use hundreds of billions of euros to rearm Europe and again prepare for this war with Russia, as we can't talk to them. How is the state of the EU at the moment? Because on the American side, they're quite concerned. They're doing very desperate cost cutting now because they want to avoid any bankruptcy. But in Europe, the situation shouldn't be that much better. There is too much debt, high interest. Where's this money going to come from? How feasible is this?
My prediction is that the European Union will not collapse over a war being lost in Ukraine. It's too far away. But they will collapse over the economic and financial results of this, after the ceasefire. Is much more dangerous for us. We now have commitments to increase our military enormously. We're talking here about billions of dollars, not only about billions of dollars. We will have to rearm Ukraine, we say. We have to rebuild Ukraine. We want to take Ukraine into the EU. I mean, these add up to trillions, which none of the countries has, not even Germany. Now we're allowing the debt brake to go in Germany, but even that one would not help. We do all these commitments while at the same time our economy is slipping down in great part because of the war. So as the war increases our costs, our ability to pay for it diminishes at the same time. And it seems to be in no newspaper, these normal newspapers, you see any article about this. I mean, it's nothing. There's nothing. I mean, you can see it. I mean, just one of the car factory, Audi also released 7,000 workers. I mean, we are in the middle of deindustrialization. How do we want to do this if our energy is 5 times as high as in the United States or China or in India? Because they get it now cheap from Russia. I mean, how can we do this? At the same time, we have now very soon a chancellor who would never be able to talk to Russia, never be able to talk to China. He has said such radical things that is not possible anymore. So how does he want to revive the economy? It's not going to happen. So we are heading for big trouble. And it's itself self-made trouble. This is a sad thing.
So we can't discuss peace because it's treasonous. We can't talk to the Russians because they have to be isolated.
But they're not isolated,
No,
We have
oh, sorry.
very good.
This is a good point. Only in Europe, but uh, but but how will this political solidarity stick here? Because once there's no voice in terms of resolving a key conflict on the European continent, and also once the economy has begun to go south, how can political solidarity be kept? Do you see
I
countries
think it will
drifting a
not
bit
be kept.
off?
It will not be kept. I don't think it will be kept. I think what we see is now very thin ice on which we stand. And the moment we have to pay for something, I mean, all the governments will go in the different directions. I mean, this is, the French cannot afford any of these. They are so indebted, and the Italians are so indebted. The Germans have this strange feeling that they could pay for it, but they can't, with a declining industry and things like this one. So I think we are in big trouble. I mean, the interesting thing is, I said it also to Sarah in the past. I said, Sarah, and with the end of the war, the real trouble for us will start. I mean, I've seen so many wars. That's what happens. What happens? And we will really be in trouble. We think, oh, the war is over, we can forget it, and we go forward. No, it's not going to happen. And especially not here, because the European Union, and including its members, have such a strange pro-war policy, which is not in their interest, which should not be in their interest, at least.
But for the Americans, they are seeing this as I guess, a necessary readjustment. The war is lost. They don't want to push Russia too close to China. They want to prioritize
Yeah.
different regions. Again, they said very clearly they don't want to
I think it's
prioritize Europe to the same extent. But to what extent do you think Europe might be heading towards some problems with the Americans, because America's putting a lot of pressure on Ukraine to accept what it's attempting to negotiate, but the Europeans are also seen to sabotage this. So, do you see what do you see in the future between the Americans and the Europeans? Because things
Oh, I
aren't
think
going
the
great.
the fault line will deepen. Definitely, it's only one direction. Now, the latest provocation is, of course, that they want to make Mrs. Baerbock the president of the UN General Assembly. And the idea behind it, I assume, is that we think in Germany the UN General Assembly is on our side because they voted for a resolution which speaks about the territorial integrity of Russia, although it was not the majority. I mean, the majority did not vote at all. And we think we can control this and have it against the Security Council, where the Chinese, Russian, and US now vote on one side. And this is a calculation that will not come. It will be an enormous provocation for us. The other provocation is, when we see it, all the money that is going to be in the Bundeswehr would be, at least financially, the largest army in Europe. In Europe, again. I mean, we have a history, no? The Germans have a history with large armies. And we always said we didn't want to have it. It might not be in numbers of personnel because they can't have it. They will have to modernize. But the financial resources available to them will be even larger than this, possibly. We don't know how to work out, possibly larger than even that of Russia. How is France going to react? How is Denmark to react? They suddenly will remember history. I cannot imagine that this is going well. I
Well,
mean, the whole EU is now governed by Germans. I mean, von der Leyen, all her advisors around her are Germans. I mean, she has a small group. They're Germans. I mean, Mr. Weber heads the largest political group in parliament, German. Mr. McAllister, despite his name, is also a German. And he heads the Foreign Relations Committee. And another German, extreme radical German, Mrs. Strack-Zimmermann, heads the Security Council. I mean, in this time of war, these are the most important positions, all held by Germans. I mean, how do the rest of Europe will react to this one? For the time being, they're paralyzed, and maybe because of this one, they stick to the thing. But I think it will break. It will very quickly break.
yeah, because well, Germany after the war, it's been known for economic prowess, its fiscal discipline, and of course, not demilitarized, but at least a very limited military potential. But now, of course, we're seeing deindustrializing Germany with economic trouble, with Mertz's new suggestion, which he pushed through in the old parliament, by the way, and to spend all this money on rearming Germany. Yeah, surely this must impact the entire way that the rest of the continent looks at Europe. No, sorry, looks at Germany over time. But who do you think will split from the Germans? I know some countries like Poland and others are not always that happy with Germany. But again, who do you think would react most negatively? Because it does appear on some level that the French and British would be happy with a trilateral partnership if the US will reduce its presence. That you have the UK, France, and Germany kind of standing shoulder to shoulder, or you don't see this necessarily.
Now, yeah, what I see now is that France and Sturman and Macron have met many times now alone, no, the two, and they have this idea of bringing their soldiers on Ukrainian territory. It's sort of their plan, which, by the way, is not repeated in the latest decision of the European Council, no, the Concilium. But that's what they want to do. I think there is a. I don't think that they work probably to, I don't know how it's going to work, but I don't think they are very friendly to German plans and things like this one. Macron flew over for half a day to Berlin to greet Merz on the whole thing, but I think that's not much more than this, no? I don't know. You know, I can't say this in the future. And the European Union is, of course, a huge thing, and it will not, but I think it will start to become that they can't make decisions anymore. It's not that people sort of stand up and saying, I'm against Germany or blah, 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 blah. But there's this undercurrent, which then suddenly Italians sort of go more often to the United States and sort of say this we can't do, and they probably use another argument. I think this is what we have. I think could imagine that the European Union, this enormous budget they have, becomes dysfunctional.
Do you see the potential, though, that the EU itself could collapse?
No, I think that's going too far. No, but I think but it will have breaks. No, it will crack. No, and we will in a few years not see the same European Union as we had now. I think the plan that we use the Ukraine war to stick shoulder to shoulder and make a powerful central state, or increasing the central state of the European Union, the sort of United States of Europe, I think that will be shattered with this war. We thought this will help, but like the German unification was done by a war, no, with the Prussian-French War in 1870, 71. And maybe it was the idea of doing it here too. But I think it's not going to work because of financial and economic difficulties this war will cause for us. So I think this shoulder to shoulder will not work. I think the competence of the EU will reduce, and I don't think that this Mrs. von der Leyen, when she came to power or took over in 1919, she promised that she will have a commission of geopolitics, meaning that Europe wants to play in geopolitics at par with the United States and China. At the time, of course, they thought Russia was out. But now it's not like this one. Look, the United States and China and Russia vote in the Security Council now along, and we withhold our votes. I mean, yeah, this is a completely changed world.
Well, I can tell in the EU Parliament that the hatred of Russia is quite intense. But how are people viewing the United States? Because again, the US under Donald Trump is taking the country in a very different direction. Is a lot of discussions around the rationale behind America's decisions and how Europe can position itself most favorably, taking into account how the world is reorienting itself, or
I can only tell you what is the official reactions among the EU leadership, and that is that there's even a greater urgency to arm and to become independent. And independence and means here not diplomacy independence, means simply being militarily stronger. And they see that's even more important because of the United States. No, I mean, as I said, enemy number one is Russia, then comes China, and then comes already the United States. And we think we can only do it by being now one of the superpowers at par with these three countries. And I don't think it will happen.
So how do you see this war ending now?
I don't know in the general population. I think it's very difficult to say. When people are asked in the streets, they say they are for negotiations, not for arms deliveries and things like this. But when they voted, like in the last Bundestagswahl, they voted in all parties which are for the war. All parties which were voted in are for the war. So I think there is a contradiction in behavior how people vote, and I can't solve that. I can just state that that's what I observe.
But do you think it will be possible for the Americans and the Russians to reach a political settlement?
Yeah, of course. What we see now is that the United States wants to have the relationship with Russia and we with Ukraine. The problem is only that the relationship with Russia might be very fruitful because they have natural resources, they have trade things, they have the access to Asia and all the rest of it. We will end up with a country which might not even survive. I mean, might be ungovernable in the future, which has a lot of problems with corruption. It will be a black hole where we put a lot of money in it, and it will not solve it. I mean, so we want to grab the Ukraine, and the United States runs off with Russia. I mean, how silly of us! How silly! How silly!
Well, what do you see? What did Russia want in this war, and to what extent do you think it can get its war objectives?
Oh, it will get all the war objectives, I think, no? I mean, the main thing is that they wanted no NATO in the Ukraine. I think that's been promised already. Even if the Europeans say that's not, but I think that will be decided between Trump and Putin and the Chinese, who also don't want the NATO in there. And the second one is that they wanted to have the access to the Black Sea. They have it now. I mean, the Crimean will never go back. And they will have also enough hinterland for the Crimean to allow the Crim to have the water and all the things that an island needs to survive. And they have the protection of the pro-Russian population in the Ukraine. Not all of them, but most of them. So I think they are the victors in this whole thing. And Putin will be very strong at home.
So,
But
yes.
with good or bad is another thing, Glenn. It's just what I think what will happen.
So, but it would seem that there has to be a strategy behind some of this. Or do you think the Europeans will actually put their troops into Ukraine if the Americans oppose it? Or because the Americans
No.
so far, they said they're happy, they don't care if the European goes as long as they don't have American protection. But that being said, uh, they would see this as something that the Russians wouldn't accept. So, but would the Europeans send their troops if they're not under American protection, or would that be
Yeah, that's
too
what the
crazy?
British and the French still plan, and they want Macron wants another meeting for this one, and he feels very strong about it. But when Rutte came back from Washington, he said two quite important things. The Secretary General of NATO, Rutte, he said twice. He said two things. One, he said that he doesn't see NATO peacekeeping, they still call it peacekeeping troops on Ukrainian soil. That's one thing. And the other thing, what he said is underreported. He said, it is time now that Europe starts to normalize its relation with Russia. The NATO Secretary General. Now, it's very interesting. When you look at the picture of the meeting in London, there you have them all on the stairs, but Rutte stands outside. He's not standing with a group. So he always indicates physically, because he's a clever politician, that he has a different role in this whole thing. So he is not NATO putting in the middle of this European plan to continue the war and maybe bringing soldiers into things. No, he stands outside. And that's very significant, because he knows, of course, who pays his salary. So I think we have already there the split, and then I think that I don't think that it will ever be possible that we have NATO soldiers on Ukrainian territory. The Russians would never allow it, and that was also the conflict in the Oval Office, no? Because Zelensky said we need first security, meaning basically we want to have NATO soldiers on our soil, where Trump accuse them of wanting to have a third world war. And it would be one, because Russia would react to it.
But is it possible, though, without the consent of the Europeans and the Ukrainians? Can the Americans and Russians still push this through?
Yeah, the Ukrainians have nothing to push. I mean, it's an agreement between Putin and and Trump. I mean, you see, Zelensky is now, he's completely unimportant in the whole thing. You see, on the one side, he agreed on this partial ceasefire the Russians wanted to have, which is greatly to the disadvantage of the Ukrainians, greatly to the disadvantage. And interestingly, that Trump also accepted it. On the other hand, he travels all the time through European countries. I think he's hardly anymore in Kiev. I mean, he was just in Finland, he was in Paris, and was in London, and he was in Brussels on the 6th of March. Now he's again in the Concilium, the EU thing. He went there again. I mean, he's all the time here. So, I mean, I think he will only survive as long as he signs on the dotted line a ceasefire agreement, which is basically the capitulation. It comes equal to a capitulation of Ukraine. And that's what he will sign. And nobody wants to replace him for the time being, because who wants to put a signature on such a thing? So that's probably his only value he has. And afterwards, I don't think he will have a political life.
Well, I agree with you that there won't be any peacekeepers from any European countries, as this would be considered intolerable for the Russians. But that being said, there is a huge front line. Once the war is negotiated to be over, there surely has to be someone has to observe that the ceasefire holds, that there's no more fighting. Again, you have a lot of experience from, well, every war in the world, pretty much. How likely, or how would this be done? The actual implementation of something
If
like
there
this. How
would
would you
be,
observe it?
if then there would be a very light observer group from the UN. I mean, the Iran-Iraq war had as well as such a long front line. I don't know. I thought even at the time, 2,000 kilometers, 1 million people dead. And we had, I think, the observer group from the UN was not more than, I think, 400 people maybe, or 200, 200, 400 people. I don't even remember. Also, it was negotiated in my house. I mean, I should know these things, but very few. I mean, they went with helicopters forward and backward. There were certain observation posts and, this type of things. What we forget, if you want to have a ceasefire, you have to negotiate it in such a way that neither of the two sides have the military ability or the interest of changing it. That is the stability, not the observation. And this is reached because Russia is very unlikely to want to occupy the whole of Ukraine. So they have their Russian parts, and maybe they want to have a few villages more or less, but this is not important. So for them to restart the war, he would risk his relationships with China and India and Brazil and these countries. Very, very important. Why should he take the risk? And then he has also a shrinking population in Russia. So why should he send soldiers to be killed for what's not worthwhile? He has reached basically, let's say, 95% of or 90% of what he wanted. So he is satisfied. The Ukraine will be so preoccupied by itself. It is only half of the population will probably further decline. I would even think that they go through a phase of being ungovernable. So they will not have the ability to change this anymore for a long time. And it will smoothen out. This makes a ceasefire line. And again, ceasefires and peace are never just, but they must be balanced in a sense that no side has an interest to change it. Also, both sides might be dissatisfied for one reason or another. And that is the art of making ceasefires. And I think what Trump is suggesting there is, I've seen many things. I think we think always Trump is dumb, but it's very professionally done how he does it, or his people, very professionally. I mean, we could only have admiration how it's done. I mean, we might not like what happens, but it's done very, very professional. Who he calls at what time, where he has a meeting, what he negotiates first, how he adapts when there's a difficulty. I must say, I have a lot of admiration for how this works. I mean, this is one of the bitterest wars we had since the Second World War, probably, no? And he ends it. And I think we should all be happy in Europe because it means that the risk of having a nuclear war, which would be on European territory, is is basically gone. I mean, I think already that one. We think we have politicians who say that there's no danger of a nuclear war, which is really irresponsible. And of course, he ends the killing. I mean, these young people are killed for nothing anymore. There will, one village more, one village less, but you kill thousands of young people. Unbelievable. It's irresponsible. And I've seen wars. I know what it means. I've seen the families who are looking for their sons. I mean, it's heartbreaking, these things. And there's nothing to do with who is guilty or not. There's also one other things people should know about wars, your listeners, is once you start to negotiate a ceasefire or a peace agreement, and it's always, you don't know what you call what. All the moral arguments we have in our newspapers will not play any role. Who did butcher would not be discussed. Who started the war will not be discussed. Who is guilty for the war, which is not always the same thing, is not going to be discussed. Otherwise, you can't negotiate. So all you negotiate is what is the military situation, what are the interested parties, and where you could find a line which is not only a physical line, but also a line of agreement on which is fairly stable. That is the art of a negotiator. And I see that's what the Americans do.
Well, in Europe, we seem to do the opposite. We only speak about how the Russians are to blame and we can't reward them and this and that. But
That doesn't play a role.
no,
No war in the world has this played. Even in a war where one side wins outright, like in the First World War, and where the Germans had to sign that they were the guilty party, it also didn't play a role. It was simply because one had the bigger stick than the other one. And 21 years later, Germany was in Paris. These things will never be solved in a war. Think about Clark's book, what is it called in English? About the First World War. 100 years later, he wrote this, and he has no conclusion. Who started the war? It is just what it is. We have to come to terms. And that's why the Americans do absolutely the right. They cut through and saying, now it's enough. We had 3 years of war. That was 3 years more than we should have had. We shouldn't kill anybody anymore. And we find now a solution. I
that's
have
one of
great admiration for Trump, I must say, not for all the other things. But on
no.
this case, I would say we Europeans are lucky.
Well, I think that's why Vice President Vance blew up in this way the White House against Zelensky, because Zelensky only wanted to talk about us, what the Russians were terrorists and all the crimes they committed, because all he could hear was, well, these are reasons why we can't talk to them, why we can't negotiate. So just
No, the
so they
real reason for the blow up was that then he said we cannot negotiate with the Russians unless I'm in a position of strength. That's what we say
more
now also
weapons.
in these papers. You see this reflected there. And that meant basically having NATO soldiers on my territory. I should fight with NATO soldiers. And that's blew the whole thing. And I think they were absolutely right to tell him that he is mad. Absolutely.
So my last question is just on on Trump's alternative to security guarantees. He's arguing, if we get to control your minerals and your power plants, this would be a security guarantee to make the Russians think twice before attacking. Do you see this as being a, a good approach, a bit opportunistic, a bit pillaging the Ukrainians, or is there some logic behind this? How?
I, I, yeah, there's probably a logic behind it, but we haven't seen really the contracts. We don't really what they mean, no? At least I haven't seen it. I don't know if you have more better access. We don't know what they have there agreed and what they have apparently already signed, no? I mean, first of all, Trump is getting back the money they have invested in the Ukraine. I mean, don't forget, Ukraine will only get a very small portion of what they export to the United States because the United States will not want to get out with debts, that are not paid. Europe will. Europe will. This is the crazy thing. So he does it this way. I have never come across such a thing. I don't know how to say this. I can't. I just can't judge it because I know too little about these things. Uh, I mean, as I said to you, the security guarantees come from within. If Russia would not be happy with it, now being much stronger, of course it would restart the war somewhere. There's always one way provocation. You have to have something where nobody has an interest to restart the war. And this is the art of negotiations. So wars ending with diplomacy and not with having more powerful weapons as we Europeans think.
Well, I pray that more common sense coming from people like yourself will prevail, because I think we're not just gambling with the lives of hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians, but also the future of Europe itself. So,
Yeah.
well, Michael von der Schulenburg, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye bye. Thank you.